Okay, am I on? That sounds great. So, an early email that was circulating, that Clay circulated as he was organizing this, referred to me as a down-to-earth, likable speaker. So I hope I receive my rise to that status. I thought, in addressing this question, are science and religion compatible? I think you'll see some interesting dovetails with what Tim just talked about. I'm going to talk less about, actually going to be a whole lot less of a biology talk like you might expect, and a whole lot more of a philosophy talk. The thesis, though, presented that yes, they are compatible if they respect their methods of knowledge. Their methods of knowledge meaning how they come to understand things, or in academic terms, the epistemology. Right? So we'll just say it's the methods of knowledge. So we'll get back to that in a minute. I want to say that, well, my thesis is yes, there's plenty of people who would say no, that they're not compatible. So here's a cartoon by Johnny Hart, BC. There once was a preacher named Charlie D., whose degree was in Christianity, but he chose to take up botany, so he sailed aboard the HMS Beagle, that is, a fox of a man on a dog of a ship, allowed his Christianity to slip, and concocted a theory, will that see, designed to make monkeys of you and me, and he did. So that's really a flashpoint of much of what I'll talk about. It circles around evolution. As a biologist, that's where I see this intersection of biology and religion and a lot of that conflict. So clearly here, Johnny Hart feels that the evolutionary science is leading us astray in lots of ways. So it's a lot more than just evolution, but there's bigger implications. That's demonstrated here in this kind of diagram or figure from creationists. This is a tree here, and at the top of this tree are all sorts of evils. We have drugs, racism, dirty books, and this is a tree that says under biological evolution, and down here is sin. So biological evolution is essentially the root of all these evils. And then this axe here is labeled creationist, and the job of the creationist is to cut that down. So again, it's much bigger than just evolution, that there's all these implications that come from this science of evolution. On the flip side, Dewsbury as well has a cartoon. Drat, those pesky scientific facts won't line up behind my beliefs. Then challenge this student. Holy flat earther, it's White House situational science advisor Dr. Nathan Hall. That's right, Suri, and I'm here to remind you, situational science is about respecting both sides of the scientific argument. It's not just the one supported by facts. That's why I always teach the controversy, like the evolution controversy, global warming controversy, not to mention tobacco controversy, mercury, pesticides, coal slurry, dioxin, Everglades, the acid rain controversy. You're right, situational science man. I'll never trust science again. It's just too controversial. Suing gets the votes to you. Once again, there is this fear on the other side. It's more than just evolution, more than just global warming, that this mindset has a whole lot of implications. Right? So really this discussion on evolution becomes a flashpoint for lots of issues. So let's come back to those methods of knowing. How does science know things? How does theology know things? At least according to me. Alright, so I would say we're going to start with, in science, the observations of the natural world. And we're going to use the scientific method that you all learned about in 5th grade or 7th grade. You're going to take the observations of the natural world, you're going to use reason, and then science comes up with its story of how it thinks the world works. And intimately involved in that is the scientific method, where you're creating testable hypotheses that feeds back to new observations or new experiments, and that feedback cycle goes through as science creates its story. I'd say reason is a big part of that. Reason is logic. In a philosophy class, this whole class is under logic. There's these classic syllogisms, as they call them, from logic. So, if P, then Q. That's a classic philosophical syllogism. So this is like Sesame Street. If you walk into your backyard and you see a letter P in your backyard, and if this is true, if P then Q, then you know that also in your backyard is a letter Q. Right? Whereas if you walk in your backyard and you see a letter Q there, what do you know? Well, you're not certain. It could have been P that created the Q, or there could be something else that created that Q. And so logic goes through all those rules and thinks through these things in this very reasonable way. All right, so that's my view of science. Let's contrast that with theology. So what's the theological way of knowing? Again, we're going to start with observations of the natural world, but we're also going to include in there revelation. Revelation, things like a Bible or a Quran or the vision of a mystic. For various revelations get added into that mix, And theology still uses reason to come up with its stories, but it also brings these revelations into that process. And what I would call is faith. It uses faith to bring those revelations into this story, mixing it with reason to get its story. Faith is sometimes referred to as a leap of faith, or what you could also think of as a leap of logic. That it's not just purely this kind of logic applied to these observations that allow these revelations to bring in, that you believe in something, you're taking that leap of faith to bring those revelations into your story. Alright, so to underscore that these really are two very different ways of understanding the world, and that if each of these sides will sort of respect those ways, we would make some progress. Let's go back to two documents. One is a science article from the journal Science, which is one of the sort of most famous, prominent journals in science. A 1964 article by Platt. It's widely cited as one of the articles that lays down clearly what the scientific method is. And a quote from that, Platt says, "What experiment could disprove your hypothesis?" He says you have to ask that experiment, ask that question to decide if it's science. If you can do an experiment to disprove your hypothesis, or a future observation that would disprove your hypothesis, then you have science. If you don't have science. Right? Underscoring this cartoon. A quote from theology, Deuteronomy, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." That this mentality of testing something, it's off the table. It's a completely different way of knowing things in theology. Okay, so I posit that we have these conflicts when these two sides don't respect their ways of knowing, so when theology starts to extend itself into science, we get a conflict. So intelligent design, which is creationism in sort of new clothes, the last maybe 10, 15 years, there's been this argument of intelligent design, and the argument is that essentially creationism, from a sort of old school creationism, is a valid scientific theory. And then push that into school districts arguing that there's the evolution controversy, that intelligent design is a valid theory. Michael Behe is one of the proponents of that. So this is an outline from his New York Times opinion piece in 2005. He says his argument for intelligent design is: one, we can recognize the effects of design. Two, biology appears to be designed, meaning the eyeballs are kind of complex, they look like they're designed. A more modern citation has been the flagellum in cells, that appears to be designed. This is a philosophical argument really he's laying down. He says, three, there's no good theory but design, so therefore, intelligent design theory reigns. In cartoon form, it says if there is a designer, then things look designed. So if we have a woman sitting down here at the womb and she's weaving something, you'll come up with this tapestry that will have this beautiful design in it. Biology looks designed. We look at butterflies. They look amazingly designed. And therefore it concludes that there must have been a designer that created that butterfly. And that's where I argue he's broken the sort of science reasoning. He's taking a leap of logic there. Only faith can take him back to say there is a designer. So he's really extending this theological view into science. There's one other, and then the other thing he's ignoring is there might be another story that would get you there. In fact, if there is biological evolution where there's diverse organisms and adaptation, you'll see diverse adapted organisms, and some of those organisms will look designed, and now you have a testable theory that sits strongly within the realm of science. Another scientist has taken this on in kind of a different approach, which is sort of intriguing. We'll come back to revisit this. This is John Abies in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2010. And he says, okay, if there is a designer, then things will look designed. Now, John Abies is a geneticist, so he looks at the genetics inside of humans, and he says, well, we have a lot of genetic diseases. We have a lot of inefficient junk DNA that we're just carrying around that isn't doing much. We have this fragile regulatory network, so all this biochemistry is really fine-tuned. When something goes wrong, the whole organism can break down. And there's these mobile elements, bits of DNA, that'll pop up from one part of your DNA and slam into other parts of the DNA and just really disrupt things. We have things like back pain. In essence, we don't look very designed, in fact. And so if we don't look designed, therefore, there must not be a designer that can program all those little details into human biology. So we'll come back to John Abies. Remember this. All right, so that's when theology gets sort of too heady and slams into science. I argue the same thing happens when science gets a little too heady and extends into theology. There's a large number of the scientific atheists, I'll call them, prominent evolutionary biologists or physicists, who take the science approach to understanding the world. And they say that's all we need. So Richard Dawkins is one of the most famous. In his book, The God Delusion, says in the title pretty clearly what his view is. Says religion is not needed for the story, so you can come up with a story in science. And he says there can only be one story. And also, by the way, religion leads to a lot of bad things, right? The Crusades are a consequence of religion. This is an uncanny parallel to me to the argument that the creationists are making, that evolution leads to a lot of bad things. And essentially, they say faith is sort of silly, right? That creates one of these conflicts. There are people out there on both sides that believe that science is compatible. So you have science, people that claim that science is compatible with theology. I'll first start with a scientist, Stephen Jay Gould, 1997, wrote a fairly famous essay now called Non-Overlapping Magisteria, or NOMA. Stephen Jay Gould is a really well-known, prominent biologist, evolutionary biologist. We don't get Nobel Prizes in evolutionary biology. Stephen Jay Gould's about as big as it gets, and evidence for that, he was in The Simpsons. Yeah. Featured in The Simpsons. So here's Stephen Jay Gould's quote. He says in this essay, quote, "The lack of conflict between science and religion arises from the lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise." Arguing that science addresses this, theology addresses this. He sees a fairly clear separation between those. You can argue whether or not you think they're completely separated or there's some overlap, but here's a scientist who's a self-proclaimed agnostic who believes that these are compatible. John Avis, that geneticist who I mentioned before in the same article, he says that they can coexist, but more than just coexist, he sees kind of a synergy, that information from one is feeding into the other. So this is an interesting quote. It says, quote, "No longer need we query a creator God's motives for debilitating countless innocents with horrific genetic conditions." Essentially, he believes that genetics has solved the problem of evil. The evolutionary genetic scientists thus can help religions to escape from the profound conundrums of intelligent design, and therefore return religion to its rightful helm, not as the secular interpreter of the biological minutiae of our physical existence, but rather as a respectable philosophical counselor on humanity matters. So again, arguing that there are these two spheres, but they're not just ignoring each other. Paying attention to each other can lead to some benefits. He says the old school view is really religion versus science. So the outdated view, he says, is that mainstream religion is over here in the same camp with creationism and intelligent design, and science, evolutionary science, is sitting over here. He says the updated view is that it's really the reasonable approaches to the world. Mainstream religion and evolutionary science are sitting over here as reasonable approaches to the world, and the unreasonable approaches to the world, the intelligent design and creationism, those areas that are overextending themselves. All right, then there's also theology, looking over at science, and there's plenty of theology that says, there's plenty of people that say theology is compatible with science. I'll cite a religious body that says they can coexist. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 2002, they passed this motion that reaffirms that there's no contradiction between an evolutionary theory of human origins and the doctrine of God as creator. A religious leader, John Paul II, leader of the Roman Catholic faith, back in 1996, published this document, and he said, quote, "There's no opposition between evolution and the doctrine of the faith." In that case, he was actually quoting the doctrine back in the 50s and 60s and said, there's no conflict here. And he goes a little further. The second statement is really interesting to me. He said, quote, "The theologian must keep informed about the results achieved by the natural sciences." So he's actually positing a positive relationship there, a synergy. That the theologian, when they're creating these stories, they need to pay attention to the natural world, to the observations, and to the science, and all the science information that's coming out of that, and feed that into their story. That they're not, in fact, in contradiction, but there's a synergy between it. But he lays down the line. He says, the moment of transition to the spiritual cannot be the object of this kind of observation. By this kind of observation, it means purely science. So he's saying there are these areas, these spiritual areas, the supernatural. That's theology. Keep your hands up. So there is a coexistence and a relationship there. So are science and religion compatible? I say yes, if they respect their methods of knowledge. Now, I'm not the first person, obviously, to say this. In fact, when someone heard I was preparing for this, they sent my wife something on Facebook. Now, I'm not a Facebook user, but there's this culture of Facebook, which some of you may know, where you have these little pictures that you send around, and pretty soon everybody's passing this picture around. So this is the picture that got circulating on Facebook right now. It's a statement by a physicist back in 1915 about how Christianity and science can, come together. Between them, I can grasp everything. There's lots of these current statements, current sort of views on the relationship between science and religion circulating on Facebook. Many of them positive sort of statements. The Dalai Lama is a statement about the relationship between science and Buddhism. So next week, circulate it on Facebook. Because of all of you, you can pass this around. I know we have to package our messages, so next week.